Welcome everyone and well arrived to It's Now Time to be wearing some long sleeves again. Finally. Now today we are talking about something that we let slip by when we went through the PTR recap of how things were going in the Raid and Mythic Plus. We were looking at the DPS and the healers, we were talking about some of the better performing specs, etc, etc. What we didn't really mention was one of the main star of the current patch of Dragonflight, which we found on the PTR not performing nearly as well compared to its sibling, which is nowadays played much less. We're talking about Augmentation Evoker being played quite a bit and doing quite well in the Raid compared to something like Augmentation, which is doing drastically badly in the Raid as one of the worst specs. Now, the reason why it's worth talking about this is because, number one, this is just broken. The logs on the PTR do not account for the damage increase of augmentation properly, so they look like they would look in-game in your damage meter, very low. So they're not that weak right now on the PTR. And number two, because it might be likely that even with the constant barrage of nerfs that Blizzard has attempted to give augmentation on the PTR as well, we will likely continue to have this spec around us as an S tier spec and mainstay meta choice for both the Raid and Mythic Plus in Season 3. So I'm afraid to everyone who was wishing for the spec to be deleted, or perhaps a little bit less drastically to just become a straight DPS spec, that's not really happening in Season 3. Now, what is going on in the Augmentation Evoker camp nowadays? There is one issue that perhaps many players who have at the very least tried augmentation have noticed. The number one thing to notice when you play augmentation is that there is a massive difference in the enjoyment you have when doing Mythic Plus compared to when you are raiding. When you are doing Mythic Plus, you are much more free to enjoy the game without having to look at a few of your features like prescience, because prescience is automatically being cast to the only other two DPS specs, or blistering scales, your tank ability and shield ability, which you can save perhaps in a moment where one of the players is taking a lot of damage, or even having to worry about Ebon Might. The targeting of Ebon Might, mostly not really a problem in Mythic Plus since you are hitting everyone. So you're free to just enjoy Mythic Plus, worry about the crowd control, the interrupts, doing damage yourself, which is more satisfying in Mythic Plus compared to when you enter the Raid. In the Raid, this changes drastically because in the Raid you have to start playing more outside of the game. You have to start min-maxing and tinkering with spreadsheets about who is going to get prescience, who is going to get Ebon Might, who am I going to be buffing, who do I have to move close to guarantee my Ebon Might is going to go towards them, do I need to start tracking the cooldowns of several DPS specs to make sure I can maximize my Ebon Might on them. It becomes much more clunky. Of course, then you also lose a lot of your utility, or at the very least it's not nearly as visible in the Raid. Your off healing or your extra shielding in the Raid is much less relevant because you have other healers to do that job for you. The crowd control that you can bring in Mythic Plus is not nearly as important in the Raid. So to many players, understandably, they do enjoy playing Augmentation Evoker much more in Mythic Plus than they do in the Raid. However, even though the enjoyment rate might differ, at the moment Augmentation looks like it's going to remain a staple pick in both Mythic Plus and the Raid in Season 3. The new tier set, while perhaps not straight up buffing augmentation in damage, did give a very good quality of life addition to the spec. They made now every third prescience be able to last 100% longer. This means that now augmentation can have quite regularly, in fact over 80% of the time, at least 3 prescience out on any target, which also means they can guarantee Ebon Might to go to at least 3 targets of their choice. meaning that now they only have to worry about one. They only have to worry about one other target who will benefit from Ebon Might, because 3 will be covered by Prescience. This has been further made better in terms of quality of life by giving you 2 Prescience charges. So now you can start storing an extra Prescience charge. For example, you can now start to wait before it's time to cast Ebon Might. You can now wait on 2 Prescience charges to use them for the Ebon Might. This is done to counteract the degenerate gameplay that Augmentation Evokers were playing around with the tier set in the PTR by starting to cast out the Presciences before the pool, so out of combat. Blizzard also made it so that now on pool Prescience buffs will disappear from players, but in exchange for that you now have 2 charges of Prescience, which makes it now even easier to spread out your Presciences to your Ebon Might targets, which is a very good choice. This is, however, still creating the degeneracy we have talked about a few times at this point when it comes to Augmentation Evoker and when it comes to stacking Augmentation Evoker. We have seen the effects, the results, the damage boosts gained by stacking multiple Augmentation Evokers, to the point that Blizzard limited the amount of evokers that can be stacked and the amount of buffs from an evoker that you can benefit from to just 4. Lo and behold, there is the possibility now in 10.2 and in Season 3 to see raid groups going exactly for that, going for 4 Augmentation Evokers, because with 4 Augmentation Evokers and the buffs of Ebon Might, you would basically be able to spread Augmentation Evoker buffs to your targets of choice, to all of the targets you want, multiple times, to multiple Ebon Mice, multiple Presciences on the same targets. It is now made much more easy because, as we mentioned, thanks to the tier set, you can now have 3 Presciences out, meaning that you only have to worry about 1 player. So the easiest solution that you can now see on the PTR would be something like this. It will be something like, we are going to mark each Augmentation Evoker. We are going to pair each Augmentation Evoker with the extra player we want their Ebon Might to go to, and then we're going to put them together. We're going to make them the closest players to each other, so that when that specific augmentation player uses Ebon Might, it's going to go to the 3 targets with Prescience and then the closest DPS. That is how you would be able, for example, to have 4 Augmentation Evokers stacking and buffing Ebon Might multiple different players, for example, giving the Unholy Death Knight or the Arcane Mage or the Enhancement Shaman multiple stacks of Prescience or multiple stacks of Ebon Might. This is something that unfortunately looks like will continue to happen even despite the nerfs that Augmentation Evoker, for example, has received on the PTR as well. Augmentation Evoker now has the max HP of their passive from 3 to 6% down to 2 to 4%. They have gotten the Molten Blood absorption nerfed by 50%, so the shield, the utility shield of your scales nerfed by 50%, and worse, of course, Ebon Might. Ebon Might used to give you 10% primary stat, now it's down to 8% primary stat. This nerf is roughly 6% of Augmentation Evoker's overall damage. Some players might argue that this is enough of a nerf to achieve some level of some level of balance state of augmentation in the raid, but the reality is that it's likely not really going to drastically change the power level of Evoker in the raid, and groups and raids will still be seeking for multiple Augmentation Evoker to stack in the raid because of the benefits of tankiness, of utility, and damage boost they can give the rest of your raid group. And this is even just primarily for the raid, because in Mythic Plus it continues to have even more qualities. They still have the quality of an Evoker, they have a knockback, they have a knockup, they still have a possible AoE stun if they so wish, they have an Enrage Dispel, they have an Omni Dispel with Cauterized Flame, they still have things like Sleepwalk, which can deal, for example, with affixes in Mythic Plus, they obviously still have an Interrupt, And on top of that, they have their own augmentation things, like an extra knockup with upheaval. They also have things like the shield, even if it's been nerfed. They have the max HP, even if it's been nerfed. So all of these things continue to be powerful enough in Mythic Plus. And once more, worth repeating, they continue to give something that, despite the nerfs, no other DPS can give to a Mythic Plus group to the extent Augmentation can, which is buffing your tank and buffing your healer. Even though when you think about Augmentation, the first thing that comes to your mind is some DPS with power infusion, with trinkets, with potion, and with the evoker buffs doing 600,000 DPS. What is actually making or breaking the spec in Mythic Plus is the fact that they can help the tank be tankier in those mega pulls. They can help the healer heal more in those mega pulls. So these are things that other DPS cannot do. Maybe a druid can use Innervate on a healer. Maybe a paladin can use Blessing of Protection on the healer. But these are minor things. They are short things with long cooldowns. They are nowhere close to the power increase given by an evoker with Ebon Might to a healer or to a tank. That is what is going to continue to make Evoker a staple pick in Mythic Plus as well, because eventually you will be rising in Mythic Plus keys to a high enough level where the question will no longer be, do we have the damage to time this key? The question will start turning. We'll start turning to, can we survive this to time this key? And when you reach that question, Augmentation Evoker is going to be your answer for the majority of the problems in Mythic Plus. Because as a DPS, they are the ones who offer you just the most safety, the most defensiveness, the most tankiness out of all of the other DPS, which is what is going to ultimately make them very likely, once more, in the new tier, still a very high sought after spec. Even after the nerfs they are receiving, and even after the 5, 6, 7, 8 round of nerfs they have kept receiving ever since they were introduced in patch 10.1.5. So for Mythic Plus, their level, their power will continue, perhaps at an even closer to the power they have now in Mythic Plus compared to the Raid, where their power will continue, even though they have been nerfed, even though they are more visibly weaker compared to their power in Mythic Plus, because as we mentioned, they just get to show off. They just get to show off more things in Mythic Plus compared to the Raid, but even in the Raid, they will still get to have a lot of value because of the power of their buffs, in particular, Ebon Might. Which is why it's worth pointing out that even though as we go through the PTR, we are checking, for example, damage logs in the PTR, and we are not really seeing Augmentation being that shiny, having that much of a high set of numbers in PTR, for example, they are still, make no mistake, they are still considered at the moment a quite high value, high priority spec for 10.2. Again, for many players, unfortunately so. Many players are kind of annoyed at this, especially pretty much every other DPS spec, who is just now realizing in 10.2 the amount of slots available in your Mythic Plus keys for a DPS have just gone from 3 to 2, so that's kind of a problem. Even worse if you realize that the meta tank of 10.2 is likely going to be Brewmaster in Mythic Plus. So you take Brewmaster, you add Augmentation, now you are missing a combat res. So if you're a spec that doesn't even have a combat res, you are in an even worse situation for 10.2 in Mythic Plus. But for the purpose of this video, just talking about Augmentation Evoker, that's their current status for the 10.2 season. The fact that they have kept getting nerfed has unfortunately resulted in what many players have been saying since their release. I am afraid nerfing them won't really fix the issue. You either have to rework the spec entirely, change it back to be a DPS, fix the fact that Ebon Might can stack on multiple players to stop the Ebon Might stacking during burst cooldowns in the Raid, or maybe stop making Ebon Might able to buff healers and tanks to weaken Augmentation in Mythic Plus, for example. As long as none of that is going to happen to Augmentation, they will likely continue to have this level of power. And for some players, unfortunately, this will include 10.2 as well. So, with what is perhaps a bit of a sad disclaimer for some players, this is what currently we have in 10.2 when it comes to the power of Augmentation Evoker. Of course, we still have some copium left in us. We still have 1 month or so before the release of the patch. Maybe there are going to be some last-minute major changes to Augmentation, but at the moment, this is what seems to await us for 10.2. So, with this augmentation question done and dealt with, I am going to leave you to the rest of your reset, the rest of your midweek. We're starting the goodbyes, of course, by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be done completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these superfluous things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I'm fine. I'm fine with this level of heat, this level of warmth. As long as long sleeves are in, I am pretty satisfied with the temperature.